the nature of this divide is such that as time progresses, the divide, if nothing else is done, the divide automatically exponentially expands, and that's the nature of all progress, right? Like progress is exponential, and because of that, the way in which the exponential divide happens, the response to that politically also happens like that, right? For instance, if you take much of northern India, where as the data points out, basic governance by the state machinery is often abject. It is comparable to sub-Saharan Africa in terms of much of their metrics, right? And in a democracy, when that happens, you can expect the natural corollary to that is that people who are contesting elections at what I want to say is the wrong level of government, but maybe wrong is the wrong word there, but essentially people who are contesting elections for the union government, then what they do is naturally take on the role of the state government and promise things thereof. And therefore, and people, when they want basic governance, such as either schools or hospitals or basic roads, are not thinking about, oh, this is not the right level of government for me to vote for. If somebody who's running for prime minister comes and says that I'm going to clean your streets, which has happened in this country, it's not the job of the prime minister to do that. And yet, if you have dirty streets, you might as well vote for that person if he's saying that, right? So that is the way in which the slow usurpation of powers of state and local governments has happened in this country. And as that divide, that is as more and more lack of governance becomes obvious in these northern states, it becomes more and more natural for people at the wrong level of government to promise actions that are, that are the domain of other layers of governance. That's one part of the problem that's particularly true in northern India. I'm not going to say that it's not true in southern India. It's also true, especially state governments usurp the powers of the local government here, right? So and this happens in varying degrees, but what happens here is that because of this usurpation of power, what happens in southern India is that two things happen. One is taxation, right? Because there are two sides to the coin. One is your ability to do something, or your whether that is your domain or not. The other is the ability to raise revenue to do the said thing, right? And southern India, by virtue of where it is, and because of this particular divide with northern India, and because of this usurpation of power by the union governments, sort of is at the receiving end at both these things, that is both taxation and the domain-specific things. That is, for instance, it ends up paying more by virtue of taxes, because we'll get into why that happens in probably later in the interview. But it ends up paying more because that power rests with the union, and then it ends up signing up with the central program, simply because that is now the primary way in which the states now get funds allocated to them for various central programs, right? So it's in a particular bind, southern India. It's like getting punished twice over, once for taxation and once for program implementation, because of this divide. Health parameters, if you take the most robust health indicator of developing societies, generally consider the IMR. And if you take that, Kerala has 6 of, I think in 2020, the updated version is 6. And the Madhya Pradesh has 48. If NFHS 4 is taken into account, it's probably, there's an updated version, but NFHS 4, according to that, it's 48, or SRS 2020, according to that, it's 48, right? Now, this difference between 6 and 48 is as stark as that between OECD countries and sub-Saharan Africa. And the people in like, how do I say this? The popular media, this discourse is almost excluded from popular media, that the difference in basic parameters of development and governance between southern and northern India is as stark as that between OECD countries and sub-Saharan Africa, right? Now, And if you consider education again, the overall gross enrollment ratio of Tamil Nadu, for instance, at a higher secondary level is about 84%. In Northern Plains, it's like less than 60% sometimes, right? So this stark difference, well, that's the reality. Now, if you ask me why that happens, the why it has multitude of reasons, right? Like there are historical reasons, like Kerala, since the Aikya Kerala movement from the late 19th century has had a series of social impact, which resulted in both greater social cohesion, because of which better governance thereof. Similarly, the Dravidian movement or the Justice Party and the non-Brahmin movement in Tamil Nadu, which is again a century-old movement, resulted in greater social cohesion, and because of which people demanded better governance, so on and so forth, right? So is that the only reason? Well, literature often cites these as contributing factors, but none of, because of which there were a series of, reform movements are one, then those reform movements in turn resulting in policy is another, that policy getting implemented is a third. Then there are extraneous factors such as access to the sea, having historical trading relationships with other Near East and Middle East neighbors. These could be other factors. Why something happens is a complicated confluence of multiple accidents, right? Like none, no one person can plan any and all of this. However, the point is that we are where we are, which basically means that we have one set of states which are as far ahead as OECD countries, and another set of states which are as far behind as sub-Saharan Africa. So to us, what we should be worried, to an average citizen of India, what should worry that person is the union government is simply incapable, and it is impossible for any bureaucrat anywhere in the world, let alone Delhi, to run these two sets of states with one policy. And yet that is what they're trying to do. It's not as if it's just unfair to the southern states. Even for a child in Uttar Pradesh or in Bihar, if a bureaucrat is trying to run that particular state's health or education with policies which are at least in part aimed at Tamil Nadu or Kerala, it becomes unfair to them because it's just not tailored to them, right? So it's one size fits all basically fits nobody, right? That's the problem. We have this, every democratic country in the world goes through this periodic reorganization of its political districts, so to speak, right? We call that delimitation in India. What happens is that, the election commission redraws the boundaries of constituencies and reallocates constituencies across states so that, it is a fair and just representation of the population of that particular point in time, right? Now, that's a normal thing to do, and it's in fact the necessary thing to do in all democracies. The problem is that in 1971, in 1975-76 rather, during the emergency, we had this thing of serious population control policy, at which point the Indira Gandhi administration also froze the constituency, in terms of the representation of each state in parliament, right? Because they did not want to have this some version of a moral hazard, right? Like that is, if you implement the population policy well, the effect of that is going to be that you have fewer people. And if the delimitation is also applied, then it would not automatically mean that you have fewer MPs representing you because you implemented a policy successfully, which is kind of a punishment for success, right? The contrary to that is, if you do not implement that correctly, the effect is that you're going to have more people, which then if you then apply delimitation to it, you will end up having more MPs, right? So essentially, if population control policy does not go hand in hand with delimitation, the effect of that is then going to be punishment for success and reward for failure, right? And this is kind of a moral hazard of sorts in a democracy, right? And to avoid that is why the 42nd Amendment, illiberal as it might be, froze a delimitation for about 25 years. In 1999, when the freeze was about to expire, they froze it for another 25 years, which is upcoming in 2026. So in this 50 years, what has happened is that what we feared has exactly come true. If you take a look at the 1971 versus 2011 census, Kerala and Tamil Nadu have the least population growth. right? Whereas Uttar Pradesh, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, all these states in the Indo-Gangetic plains have had population growth which Malthus predicted, right? Which is like they basically doubled their population for about 25 to 30 years. Which this and that the contrast is that Tamil Nadu and Kerala have had less than replacement fertility rates for over a generation now, and Tamil Nadu is set to is going to be the first state to experience negative population growth in the decade between 2031 and 2041. So when you have both these sets of states in the same union and you apply a delimitation, given that you had a certain population policy of sorts in the 70s, it is almost like going to the Tamil person or the Malayali person and telling them, listen, because you implemented your policies well and you sent your girls to school, what you're going to do is we're going to take away your political representation and give it to people in Indo-Gangetic plains, which is extraordinarily unfair, but that is what delimitation threatens to do, right? And that the other side of the coin is also problematic, right? Is if we allow status quo to sort of continue and we freeze it for another 50 years, what we're telling the person in the Indo-Gangetic plains is, hey, listen, because your governments provided you with bad governance, because of which not enough girls went to school and not enough education happened, because of which there was high fertility rate. Because of all of that, you do not have the equal power as a Tamil person or a Malayali person, which is again unfair to those people, right? So we do not want either of these things to happen. But the problem is that the first part is particularly, impactful or hurtful to Tamils and Malayalis, because they actually, like, how do I say this? Suffering consequences for not doing something is one thing, but suffering consequences for doing something exactly rightly, correctly for what you were told to do is an order of magnitude different, right? And that's what is the problem here with the Tamil and the Malayali person, right? And this conflict in 2026 is probably going to be India's most serious, significant conflict in post-independent India. And how we solve that is, probably going to decide the fate of the union in times to come and decades to come. So there are a few aspects to Karnataka, right? Like if you look at the southern basket, so to speak, they're generally doing better than the Indo-Gangetic plains. You take Maharashtra as well as part of the southern basket, because, well, where do you put it? So you just take it in. Karnataka sort of does reasonably well in midday meal schemes, getting children to school in early and middle school. And it does reasonably well in health indices. The place where Karnataka slips, and it does reasonably well in economic activity. The place in which it slips, and that which is a worrying factor, is that it doesn't retain enough of its children from what is high school, middle school to high school, right? That a lot of children seem to drop off, and it particularly girls seem to drop off, right? And why that is, it's again, like I said, the why of it is a far more difficult question to answer than just staring at the data and seeing that the problem is obvious, right? Now, a convenient and sort of like, how do I say this? The knee-jerk reaction that people who have been watching the news in recent times would like to point to is that, hey, you're not even letting girls with hijab walk into schools, then how do you not expect this to happen, right? But the problem is that the data precedes the hijab ban. Because I started writing the book in 2020, the data is from 2017, 18 or 18, 19, right? So Karnataka has had this problem even before this particular round of Hindu nationalist fueled problem came about, right? But they've been having, this just adds fuel to fire, but they've had this problem even before. And why that exists, getting girls to school or stopping dropout rates from middle to high school has a variety of reasons, right? Girls drop out of school because of poor menstrual hygiene. Girls drop out of school because of generally poor security system in the, parents, if they fear for, security of their children, girls are the first to be stopped from going to school because of fear of sexual violence, right? And so, does this point to that? I don't know the answer to that question, but the fact is that Karnataka has a certain problem there, and I hope policymakers seriously address those things. subnationalism sort of, as the name implies, like, the idea of a Malayali identity being born in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Similarly, a very strong Tamil identity being born in the early 20th century, and both of these as offshoots of, social movements in those two respective states. Similarly, a very strong Punjabi identity, which again resulted in that's the case with even Maharashtra for that matter, in pre-independent India. So larger degrees of subnationalism have generally accounted for greater social cohesion, which in turn has made people sort of participatory democracy requires you to think of your society as, your society, so that altruism does not feel like a cost to you. Right. It's a necessary condition for all democracies to thrive, which is the reason why we often, Scandinavian countries do really well, because that bond and trust in society is very, very high. Right. Now, if you some version of that seems to be happening in Tamil Nadu, Kerala, etc. Right. By no means am I arguing that, Tamil Nadu is Sweden, but hopefully this will end up, driving us towards that trajectory. The opposite, however, is true when you have nationalism or some version of that for what is 1.3 billion people, right? Like, it is very difficult for you to feel my society when the size is 1.3 billion people, right? Like, you could just increase it a little bit and, have it at 7.5 billion, which is the entire population of the world. It's very difficult for you to feel that kind of my society feeling to such a large number. Now, modern Indian states in 2022 probably have populations which are still too big for thinking of it as my society, right? Therefore, what is the point of optimality at which people will have this sense of my society is an important question. And that is, I hope the solution that I've offered naturally finds that equilibrium. But to answer your question, you're right in that the ideas of nationalism, because of the sheer size of India, which is 1.3 billion people, it's very difficult to sort of enable that sense of belonging to such a large group and treat it as your in-group and then feel that altruistic sense towards it, right? Which is the reason why, if you look at Uttar Pradesh's indices, Uttar Pradesh has a particularly low subnationalism and a very high sense of nationalism, right? And if you look at all their policies and if you look at the literature, all policies tend to be looked at from the perspective of either religion or caste or some version of it, and not as a public good, so to speak. Whereas in states where there is subnationalism, policies which are generally considered public goods, such as health, education, they do not fall under the prism of caste or religion. I'm not trying to argue that, again, that Kerala or Tamil Nadu happen to be utopias where caste and religious differences don't exist. They exist. But when it comes to public goods, at least they're looked at as public goods and not as, a zero-sum game amongst these groups. Given that, India's size, its divergence, and all the problems of governance that we have just spoken about, if you analyze the root cause of all of this, it becomes pretty obvious that the transmission efficiency of people's will in terms of our vote resulting in policy is terrible in India, right? And when you have such a system, what is going to happen is that people who are occupying chairs with power are going to accrue more and more powers to the chair that they occupy, because that's human tendency, right? Like, at the end of the day, we are all human, and we want more power to the chair that we occupy. And when we have such a skewed system, it just ends up with bad governance outcomes, as we have seen. So how do we solve this problem of improving the efficiency of that is the transmission efficiency of the will of the people, and then hope that the rest of the pyramidal structure of power in India hopefully is inverted because of the way in which the will of the people is transmitted? So let me backtrack. If you agree that the problem is the poor efficiency in terms of transmitting the will of the people, the solution to that is that if the will of the people is transmitted correctly and accurately, the hope is that the seat of power inverts itself and sort of decentralizes to the point where the transmission efficiency is the most optimal, right? That's the basic, like, how do I say this, hypothesis of this particular direct democracy, right? Gamified direct democracy. But we need to have sufficient guardrails because, ancient Athens had direct democracy. What they did was just, poison Socrates to death. Right? We do not want direct democracies to become vehicles of majoritarian tyranny, right? Especially in this hyper Hindu nationalist environment that we live in. It's a legitimate fear of many minorities that, if you have direct democracy, it will automatically descend into majoritarian tyranny, right? So the question then I've asked is, how do we arrive at a system which results in a good transmission efficiency or near perfect transmission efficiency of the will of the people, and yet does not descend into tyranny, and in the process, this inversion of the power structure or the inversion of the power pyramid happens organically and naturally so that nobody has to actually do something about it. One of the hopes of gamified direct democracy is precisely addressing that particular problem, which is that, I think, 20, 30 years from now, I'm pretty sure sociologists and anthropologists are going to write many, many papers arguing how the abrupt and sudden democratization of the internet just overnight, sometime in 2014, resulted in some version of the politics that we have, because it's the first time that so many people had, I don't know, 4G penetration jumped from some 5% to upwards of 80% or 75%, within like 5-6 year period, right? And that obviously has serious impact, and we are seeing that now, right? Like, blaming politicians here is easy, but like, if you and I were in the position of Hindu nationalists and we were trying to win elections, you and I would probably do the same thing, right? Like, because we are all at the end of the day self-interested individuals, and if something works, however evil it might be, we want that to work in our favor, right? And human beings are also great storytellers to themselves. They probably have convinced themselves that it's a great thing, right? Like, and that's how all civilization works. So the point is that when you have such an environment, the solution then has to be somebody taking a step back and thinking about, yes, so the representative model of democracy evolved at a time when this democratization of information and the ability of everyone to say whatever they want and have it, like, how do I say this? The reach of an ordinary individual now via various social media platforms is comparable to a baron or a lord in England in the medieval era when this idea of representative democracy in the Westminster model came about, right? So given that imbalance, to then continue with the Westminster model is probably a recipe for disaster, and that is precisely what is resulting in this extreme nationalism and religious polarization that you see. So hopefully, if you give accountability and impose a cost on that through this gamified direct democracy that I have discussed, hopefully we will arrive at an equilibrium one more time, right? Because it's very easy to say that that's a terrible thing, don't do that, right? But people, that's no solution, right? Like, hopefully the solution is that there is like, how do I say this? There is an inbuilt cost benefit for all of people's actions, so that they then act in their best interest to move forward, right? If in absence of that, we are going to descend into chaos. As like, I'm not the first person to say that. Plato has said that, like, yeah.
Subscribe to the Federal's YouTube page for more interesting updates.